Now we're assembled with Niall Ferguson, Tisch Professor of History, Harvard University. He's written 45 or 60 books. When's the next book come out?
The next book comes out in March.
What's going to be on?
It's called Civilization, the West and the Rest.
Very good. Well, you wrote The Western Ascendancy here a number of years ago. The big theme here, the Eastern Ascendancy, is it legit, or is it just the theme of 2011? Is the East in ascent?
Well, I think it's been the theme for much longer than that, though finally it's sunk in here at Davos. If you think about it, Japan began the return of Asia to the world economic stage a long time ago now.
True.
But in the last 30 years, the big story has been China's belated return to the world economy, and I think we now are at the stage when China is close to being an equal in economic terms of the United States. Nobody predicted that even 10 years ago.
I interviewed Bill Clinton. It is a global initiative here. It was a year or 2 years ago. And what he was just speaking about as we saw him at Davos is what he and I talked about, the new American strategy. We took it off of Fareed Zakaria's Multipolar World, off of Samuel Huntington. It's a new American projection to the world. How do you define that? Is it hub and spoke, or is there a three-dimensional thing you see that we need to know about? What will the new American projection look like?
Well, we should probably stop talking about poles, because you can't have multiple poles. You're allowed two. That's the way it works. And in some ways, it's a bipolar world now. Whatever anybody else says, there's the United States and there's China. Now, I spoke for a while about Chimerica. I guess it was 3 or 4 years ago that I coined that word to describe the symbiosis of China and the United States. I think that's breaking down now, because the Chinese no longer need the United States the way they did a decade ago. So perhaps it's just going to be a bipolar world in which there's a new kid on the block, a new rival to the United States, and in some ways economically a far more threatening rival than the Soviet Union ever was.
A fistfight today. The president of France and James Diamond, I don't know if you were there, but they sort of went after it over the tone that finance should speak to government, or at least to French government. This tension's always been there. You have 2 volumes, I believe, on the Rothschilds. How should finance speak to democracy?
Well, French democracy is a special case, because French democracy has been on the case.
You said with a British accent.
Well,
continue.
Of course I take that view, but it's true that France has been hostile historically to finance. The French Revolution was, but even before that, the French had a history of defaulting and beating up on the bankers, even in the time of the Bourbon monarchs. So it's not entirely surprising to hear Monsieur Sarkozy lecturing Anglo-Saxon bankers and expecting them to be more obsequious. Well, in his eyes, they are, because they believe in wretched things like the free market. But, I mean, this is an argument that I think he's quite likely to lose, because in the end, there's still a major banking crisis at the heart of Europe. It affects French banks, it affects German banks, and, of course, Spanish banks too. And that crisis hasn't been resolved in the way that I think the United States dealt with its banking crisis. And I think the Europeans are paying dearly for postponing the evil hour of recapitalising or killing off insolvent banks. What we call the sovereign debt crisis, when you look really closely at it, is really a crisis of banks. And guess what? State-owned banks have turned out to be the problem.
Counterfactual forward. When do the banks finally take a haircut in Europe? What does it take, with your study of history, for institutions to say, we will give way? Alan Greenspan told me it's got to be a shared pain. Yeah. When does this happen?
Well, we have a good example of what needs to happen in the case of 1980s, 1990s Latin America. What Europe needs is Nick Brady. It's Brady bonds. It's not happening because the Europeans do not want to acknowledge how big the losses are in institutions like the German Landesbank.
Roy Smith at NYU wants Trichet bonds playing off of the Brady bonds. How do you get the catalyst for that?
I don't honestly know, because it seems to me the crisis is taking on such an ugly form when you look at the fiscal problems of countries like Ireland and Greece. It could be much more easily solved this way, and yet there isn't a real political will to do that. I would far rather have heard President Sarkozy talking constructively about dealing with these problems, rather than just expecting a change of tone. It's not a change of tone we need, it's new balance sheets for these insolvent banks.
Never enough time. 20 seconds. The Davos of our discontent is my theme this year. Where's the discontent?
Well, the discontent is it seems to me, absent by comparison with recent years.
Sure.
Perhaps that was the Davos of panic. But people are uneasy, and I think rightly uneasy, because after all, we're having a World Economic Forum in Europe in a world that's increasingly Eastern.
Are you laughing at my hat?
I love your hat. I wish I had one.
So we're going to Niall Ferguson hat. When you come to New York, we're going to 57th Street, Worth and get you a hat.
It's a deal.
Niall Ferguson, Harvard University. I'm buying a hat in New York.